Good evening. How's everybody doing? Beginning of a new semester, a lot of anxiety, a lot of reshifting of schedules and things like that. I know how it is. But what better way to start off than with a great event like the one we have been going on all day with these amazing scholars who've come in from all over the country under the invitation and organization that our newest, one of our newest professors in the Graduate School of Education has provided, Dr. Eos. So thank you for that. We are especially pleased that so many people have made it out through the rain, but keep in mind that there are also 150 or more people who are attending this event on Zoom. So they have a QR code that they can drop questions in, they can pull it up in the chat and drop questions that they have, and so they will be able to be involved in the discussion. Also, when we come time to have some audience participation for the great work that these scholars are gonna address and discuss. Particularly want to honor and recognize our new dean, Dean Michelle Young. She would have loved to have been here today for this event. Feel some of the power, feel some of the energy. But of course, we're in her stead trying to continue on with this good work. As well as, I also mentioned Eos, one of our newer professors, but Bruce Fuller has been very integral to making this event take place. So thank you, Professor Bruce Fuller. And I have a special shout out for Tony Bright because he also submitted to a Equity Leadership Now podcast. And is actually the first person in the podcast series to get the new Equity Leadership sweatshirt. So it was, he certainly earned it. He gave us a really impassioned and insightful set of responses to the questions that we had developed for him, and that will be coming in the pike too. And finally, of course, the School of Education is central to this event. The BSE is definitely trying to do more in the way of making these direct connections between some of the best scholars in the world and our audiences in the School of Education, as well as the connections that we're making for the research that they're doing to actual practices going on in the field. And in line with that, and I'll close with this, 21 CSLA is also one of the supporters of this event, one of the co-sponsors along with the BSE of this event. And we're excited also because it's so directly in line with the work that we're attempting to do across the state of California. As you know, we have the State Center right here at UC Berkeley, and then we have the Alameda region right here at UC Berkeley, but there are 6 other regions around the entire state of California, and we do significant work in terms of helping to guide the professional development of leaders who are school site leaders, who are teacher leaders, who are district level leaders. And we're in the second 3-year cycle of our grant funding. We've just completed the first 3 years, and now we're moving into the first year of the second 3 years. So with that, I want to invite Professor Bruce Fuller up to begin our program.
Thanks, Jabari. Thanks to Jabari and Rebecca and their staff for organizing this event. And thanks to Eos for instigating this event. He's pulled together just 3 wonderful folks that have been very involved in school organizational change over the years. And Eos has already added a lot of spark and energy to our community, so thanks to him as well. If you're online out there in the cloud, and you want to submit a question, I think there is a QR code, as Jabari mentioned, on your screen, or you can go to slido.com, SLIDO.com, and enter the event code PANEL, P-A-N-E-L, and you should be able to submit your question. Did I get that right, Eos? Okay. And about halfway through the program, we'll be turning to questions from folks that are on Zoom. I'm delighted just to moderate the conversation among my 3 colleagues and get into some questions and discussion with you all in the audience. I just wanted to say a couple of things. One is, as a sociologist, we're constantly reminding students and colleagues that the individual is really not the basic unit of human civilization, it's actually the organization. So if you come from the Western canon or you read the New Testament, forget about individuals. In the modern world, it's really about organizations and institutions. We run into these institutions, whether you're registering for classes on Cal Central, which is joyful, I know. More joyful is going to the Student Health Center. Maybe you can escape to In-N-Out Burger. But in any of these situations, you're running into a formal organization with all the warts and blemishes and joys of those institutions. And in education, the folks that are here today, Amanda, Jenny, and Tony, have really spent their careers thus far in trying to improve school institutions and school organizations. While they're based at universities, they don't really spend much time in the ivory tower. They take the stairs down and spend most of their days in schools. The other way to think about this is I always think about institutional change as the flip side of leadership. We teach leadership, but the end goal is to try to improve and enrich institutions. So today we're going to launch into a conversation around how these three wonderful colleagues have tried to change schools and their settings, and then enter into a dialogue with you and those of you online. Okay, so it's all about institutional change. Those of you who are studying leadership, I think this is going to be super, super helpful, I hope. So think through your own questions and issues. So on my far left is Amanda Datnow, who's at UC San Diego. She's been involved for many years in a research practice partnership in San Diego County. To her right is Jenny Noguoka, who runs the Chicago Consortium for School Improvement. And her intellectual ancestor is Tony Brake, who started the consortium at Chicago. And for those of you that don't know, the Chicago Consortium is probably the most effective, long-running organization in the United States that's worked in partnership with the Chicago Public Schools to try to improve outcomes for kids. And they've had really quite miraculous results that we had the pleasure of talking about this morning over at the Ed School. So we're going to start with kind of a question of what their work is about, how they've experienced research practice partnerships, what they've learned from that, and I'm going to start with Amanda.
My work focuses on K-12 educational reform and policy, and I'm particularly interested in dimensions of equity and also the professional lives of educators.
Jenny?
I'm the deputy director at the consortium, so I do a lot about thinking about us as an organization and how are we more effective in our partnership with the Chicago Public Schools. But specifically, my research interests are centered around the transition from high school to college and beyond.
Hi, I'm Tony Brake. I'm President Emeritus, Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. What that translates into is I no longer have the primary responsibility for running an organization, its budgets, and all the personnel issues that arise, and I can actually return to thinking about things. Very much grounded in the work that I did in Chicago, I've become a student of organizations, and particularly the question about how is it that these places get better at what they do, and how we can accelerate these processes around learning to improve. So stuff there.
Great. So Amanda, you want to talk to us a little bit about your research practice partnership in San Diego County and what's worked, what hasn't worked, what
Sure.
you're learning?
I'll talk about one of them. I will say that it's important probably to know that there are 42 school districts in San Diego County. So it's a bit different than some other jurisdictions in that there's a wide variety of places one could be partnering and doing this kind of work. And so the one I'll talk about a little bit today is with a mid-sized school district. And this is a district that had some pressing questions about how to improve, and particularly they were focused on the earliest elementary grades as an area to address, because they had the sense that if they focused on those earlier grades, that perhaps some of the opportunity gaps that they saw later on would be less apparent and there'd be less time spent on remediation and so forth. And so we've had a long-term relationship with them that involved a whole set of different activities, but about 8 years ago now or so, we started attending some meetings with them, and we ended up deciding to build a project around educators' concerns. And so we had an opportunity over about 6 months to gather information from teachers about what were their pressing questions, what were the things that were bubbling up in their context that they wanted to know more about. And so we formed an interdisciplinary team of researchers, both within education and also in neuroscience at UCSD, to help them address these pressing questions, which all fell under the broad umbrella of what do we know about children's development across school and home, and how can knowing this help us support educational change in this particular district? And so we've been doing this work, gathering data in a variety of different ways over a number of years. And one of the things that's endured over a long stretch is as an entity we called a teacher-researcher collaborative. And so once a month we meet with this group that's comprised of teachers, administrators, ourselves as researchers. And we share some excellent research, either our own or something else that's going on that they're really interested in happening in the field. And then we dialogue with them about what are the implications for practice. And so this has been a really useful feature of the work to kind of have an ongoing dialogue with educators about the work that's happening. And I'll share more a little bit later.
What's been your success or challenges in terms of arriving at a common definition of what the problems are inside the district?
Well, I think that one of the difficult aspects is that the pressing issues change too. So over this period of time, I mean, they've gotten more refined in how they think about their concerns. And so teachers have a set of concerns, and some of them might be things like, I'm seeing new behaviors in my classroom that I'm not accustomed to, or, you know, and how do I address that? But, you know, at the policy level, people are thinking of things like, why is there a strong overlap between our English learner population and the students identified for special education? Can we help figure out what's happening there, and why are we getting this thing evolving, and how do we address that? So I'd say the questions really sometimes differ. And so the hard part for us is to try to think about how do we leverage research in a way that helps different people address their concerns over time.
Jenny, how do you go about directing the Chicago Consortium, and what are you learning about research practice partnerships?
Oh, what are we learning? I don't know. I mean, it's sort of how we think about things has evolved over time. I think like when Tony started, I think there's both some of the founding principles I think that continue on, but the organization also changes over time. I mean, I think kind of like the founding principles, I think, were a lot about how, you know, we're at the University of Chicago, but our research is centered around the challenges that schools are facing. So we're always working in close partnership with them. A lot of this is dependent on the relationships that we have with people inside of the district and inside of schools, so that we actually understand the context and the nuances of the challenges that we're faced, so we can be asking the right sorts of research questions that can actually support change that's happening inside of the schools. We also pay a lot of attention to things like measurement, developing indicators to be able to track progress, to understand the nature of the problem. How is this different inside of schools? And I think part of what we've also done a lot that sort of helped support us a lot is that we also have a partner organization called the Network for College Success, which I think who actually helps us translate our research into what's happening inside of schools. 'Cause I think one of the things and the principles of the consortium and how we think about a research practice partnership is that as researchers, we have a great understanding about the broad picture of things. We can develop research evidence. We can help people learn how to measure it. But ultimately, thinking about what do you actually do in a specific school or in a specific context has to come from the people in there. So our job isn't to tell them what the answer is or what they should be doing. It really is around pointing people in the right direction, giving them the tools, building their capacity to engage with these things. And then our partner sort of helps translate the data and the research. And then it also, and then they help engage with them to be thinking about the data, to be asking them the right questions to help people learn from each other, so that the research actually has an impact in the longer term.
What motivates a principal or a district administrator in Chicago to work with you? I mean, what's in it for them? Are there problems that they're casting about for ideas, or?
I mean, I think like we listen and we have relationships with them. I mean, I think a lot of this is taking the time and not coming in and thinking that we know what the answers are, or we're there to tell them what to do. We try to hear their perspective on it, because we can learn as much from them as they can be learning from us. And so there's truly this reciprocal relationship. And I think there's a lot of trust over time, because I think it's been clear that the way we approach our research is that we think, we're doing research, but we pay as much attention to engagement with people inside of the district, building a high level of trust, making sure that how we're posing our questions and the research that we're producing is set up in a way that is designed to be actionable and helping them think about what's happening inside of their schools. We're doing it in a way that's really accessible, whether it's visually. We're also trying to think about other ways. Like, I think we're sort of trying to move into the 21st century and not just doing things in terms of reports, but thinking of things like podcasts, or are there doing short videos and other ways that are much more accessible than sort of our standard longer reports that people quite often don't have the time to do.
Tony, you've been at this for a while. I think I was in middle school when I read your first book.
Oh, thank you, Bruce. we were just talking about how 35 years the consortium, pretty close to 35 years, the consortium's been at this a long time.
And what are you learning? I mean, also thinking about your work in terms of continual education, continual improvement, science. What are the big takeaways so far?
Well, the work I engaged in Chicago through the consortium, and there was also a parallel organization operating at that point in time called the Center for School Improvement, which eventually got absorbed into something called the Urban Education Institute. And I only mention that because the center work was focused on the ground. We were out in some of the most troubled schools, the most marginalized schools in the Chicago public schools, in some of the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago, which means poorest neighborhoods anywhere in the United States. And at that point in time, it was decentralization reform, so you got local school councils. So the agents of improvement are out there in the schools. And we're trying to work through this relationship issue about what is it that we know and can do that can be of value in this kind of relationship building space around trying to solve problems that they've identified and they want to work on. And so we were doing all of this before this language of research practice partnerships existed. That work of being deeply grounded in the work that actors in schools were doing, I always thought about that as the lifeblood of the work we did in the consortium, where we're doing studies of what's happening in the system. But when you're deeply engaged in the schools, they're like other voices on your shoulder, in addition to your methodological voice or your conceptual frames. And it's so deep into how you shape studies and how you understand, when you're looking at data displays, what's going on in that data display? Well, oftentimes it's these other voices. When I came to the foundation, it was essentially a chance to step out of the work, and when we were doing all that work, it was kind of like, well, this seemed like the sensible thing to do. A problem came forward and we could do this, but I couldn't have articulated why we made the kind of critical decisions we were making along the way. But in coming to the foundation, I had a period of time where it was a chance to sort of take a little stock taking, and that's where the 6 principles of improvement came forward. And what this work on improvement science and networked improvement communities is largely about is there's been much of the research practice partnerships has been researchers bringing ideas. I want to work with you around your problems, but the impetus is from the researchers out into practice. What in a big picture point of view, what we've been trying to do with this networked improvement communities is to bring this practice of what you might call the scientific discipline of identifying problems, seeing about how systems create these chronic failures over and over again, seeing the mechanisms at work, and how can we target, but to get that logic, that scientific logic, that we're all trained in, to get that to become essential part of the professional logic, so that educational professionals are scientists too. Because when we were writing the book, we had a lot of conversation about whether we would adopt the term improvement science, because it came out of healthcare. And educators didn't like the word science, and maybe we should call it something else. But then I we talked about this a lot. But in the end, I kind of came to this through a kind of political lens. Well, science has cachet. It has status in society. If educators give that status to somebody else, they're going to tell you what to do. And that by bringing this scientific logic into the professional work as a central part of the work of educators, part of the intent was that this should be an empowering experience, because they understand the problems better than anybody else. And in the research practice partnership, this is real co-design work. I know some things, I can do some things, but I can't solve this problem. I can be a contributor to solving a problem, but I can't do it myself.
How do you think, question for everybody, this is a kind of a mindset shift, right? And we do see educators out there changing their mind, shifting their mental maps around social emotional learning, or more holistic approaches to relationships with students. Has the continuous improvement science and RPPs, has that added to these shifts in mindset among principals and leading teachers? If so, how?
Well, I can speak to it in the context of principal development, education leadership preparation. My predecessor, Lee Shulman, had started a program at the foundation called the Carnegie Program on Education Doctorate. And it was an attempt to reinvigorate EDDs as the doctorate for practice. And I inherited that when I came to the foundation. And I joined their community at a few meetings. And at that point, they were struggling with what should the culminating task be for a professional practice doctorate, because the original research task, which is exactly the right task for preparing scholars, was clearly not the right task for a practice-oriented doctorate. And so I kind of mulled it for a while, and then I kind of asked the question, well, what do your people do when they leave you? And basically what I learned was, well, they're going into organizations, into some role of leading an organization, and they're supposed to help that organization get better at what they do. So that leads me to ask, well, what in the structure of the program you've created for them helps them lead improvement in an organization? And if the central work of this leader is supporting the improvement in the organization, then shouldn't the culminating task be some demonstration of skill in that practice? And shouldn't it be organized around that? Because that's the work they're supposed to be doing. So that's, and out of that came, I wish Michelle was here, because I interacted with Michelle with this when she was at Virginia, because we set up something called iLead, which had 11 different partnerships of colleges, leadership programs in colleges of education that were working in partnerships with districts. That the central work, a central piece of the work in the partnership was that there was a research practice partnership, and it was around addressing some problem in the district. And the people coming out of the district into the preparation program were going to work on that problem as part of that culminating task. And the curriculum now is now in the process of being revamped to prepare people to become improvement leaders inside of organizations. And that was transforming the curriculum in the colleges of education. It was transforming professional development in the professional development offerings inside the districts. And these people were now regularly talking to each other about this task, about how we get better at doing the work we were doing. So that was a case where this work, where these ideas, this logic, if you will, was having a fundamental change inside these two institutions.
I think Rebecca and Jabari here, a lot swivels on a problem of practice for principal leadership and the EDD students. So somebody here heard you, Tony. But what are we, I mean, do you all, Amanda, Jenny, think the university is changing the mindset of principals, the mindset of superintendents? I mean, you hear people talking about professional learning communities. You hear superintendents talking about whole child approach and actually nurturing teachers to get to know students. What a crazy idea. I mean, is that coming out of the academic conversation in concert with practitioners, or are we succeeding in moving the beast somehow?
I think absolutely in the context of our leadership programs, for sure. You know, in our case, it's the EDD where much of that work happens, and I think the impact's been fairly profound in terms of, especially when you look countywide at what that has done. In terms of also building networks between people in those places, which is really powerful as well. I think another interesting direction, which I just wanted to speak to for a minute, is the preparation. If we're going to do this work well, I think the preparation of also people who are getting PhDs and who plan to go university routes needs to look different as well, because typically we haven't trained people to work closely with practitioners out in sites, even those same people who go and work in programs and teach them. And so for us at UC San Diego, we launched a new PhD in, I want to say 6 or 7 years ago now, and it's a PhD in transforming education in a diverse society. It's the only PhD we offer. And it's an kind of interdisciplinary program in a lot of ways, but part of what we did was design it with in mind that the students who graduate from that program need to know how to roll up their sleeves and work side by side with practitioners and policymakers. And so their coursework in some ways looks similar to what you might see in a typical PhD program that's been around for many years, but there are other aspects to it that are different. So classes on transforming learning outcomes, transforming policy, you know, different types of coursework, as well as communicating research classes so that they have the full battery of research methods, but they're also learning how to communicate to different audiences, and they're working with faculty, many of us, to do this kind of work with the belief that we can't have, that all, and though their dissertations look like dissertations in any place, the ways in which they're learning to do that work and to hopefully disseminate it later might be a little bit different. So the goal being that there's much more intersection between research and practice, and so that people are prepared to do that work. And it has implications also for how we recruit students, because you know, we're often looking for, of course, for research experience when we admit students to those programs, but to that program. But at the same time, what if we were also thinking about things like community organizing, other kinds of things that people had done in their past work and around that might be useful skills for doing that kind of partnership work that we know is going to be critical for them for their research to have an impact on practice.
Jenny?
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of speak from like the research practice partnership perspective. I mean, I think it's kind of interesting because I think at the consortium, we don't do a lot of work directly with principals, but we're trying to shape what's happening inside of district, how different organizations are working with principals. We sort of are shaping the larger ecosystem, or to use the term in Tony's book, the exoskeleton of the different organizations that are happening and how they're thinking about different types of problems. Because I think, you know, like we're one organization, we don't directly train principals, but we can do a lot to really inform how other organizations, how central office is approaching it. So I think there's I think we're sort of in the privileged position that people inside of central office, like they trust us, and so when we have research coming out, they actually pay attention to it, and that sort of trickles down out into the schools. I mean, I've had principals tell me that like every single time a report, we release a report or have different types of findings come out, principals are paying attention to it because they know that it's going to be, you know, they're going to get sort of ahead of the game because central office will be paying attention to it. Sooner or later, some form of this is likely to be something that they will have to understand in a different way, and so they see it as valuable because they hear the work that we're doing. I mean, I think there's also an aspect of our approach to working with central office and working with schools where it really is about saying that, you know, there's a huge amount of capacity and knowledge, and the solutions to what the challenges that are being faced in schools are really things that educators, you know, if they are given the right type of evidence and approach and the right types of data and the time and the structures to do this, that they can actually solve it. And so that, I think, has also shaped how the district works with schools, how they think about things. And so there's less of a tendency for the district to buy a program when there's something that they want to do. So something like social emotional learning, it wasn't like, oh, we need to buy the program from this vendor, we'll ship it out to the schools, and that will be our approach to this. It's been a very, very different way of thinking about it. They have, you know, and this has been a big emphasis in the Chicago Public Schools. And just kind of touching on one of your previous questions, you know, the consortium had developed a framework thinking about social emotional learning where we were trying to draw on all of the research that was out there and create something that was coherent, but it was much more oriented toward education, and saying social emotional learning is, you know, it is completely intertwined with all of the learning that is happening inside of classes. And then we developed a survey to measure that, in which, starting last school year, now all of the students from grades 6 through 12 are taking this survey twice a year. It happened a little bit faster than we probably would have cared for it to, but the districts really see this as being something that is vital to their emphasis on student experience, to really understand how students, you know, what students are experiencing in the classroom, how this is shaping their learning outcomes. And so a report that we had over 10 years ago is now something that is, you know, in front of different classroom teachers and is being used inside of schools.
So part of that is to nurture principals who are more reflective and mindful of how SEL might fit into the core activities of the school, as opposed to just buying software off the...
Yeah, I mean, it does place, you know, it does place more of a burden in terms of time and building their capacity, so it is a different thing. So it is, in some ways, it is just easier to buy a program. They tell you what to do. You can check that box that you're trying to address something, but that's not really how lasting change happens inside of schools. I mean, vendors cost a lot of money to do, and if you're actually helping teachers understand what this means, how they can actually build their own practice, that's how we actually think about having enduring change inside of the district. It's not through just having someone come inside and sort of say, this is how you're going to do it. It's really saying that if we improve teachers' how they're thinking about their students, how they're thinking about the relationships, how they're developing intentionally their classroom environments, that's how we can really build you know, learning and development inside of classrooms and really lead to lasting change inside of the district.
Tony?
Yeah, what the strength of the consortium is that, in jargon from social learning theories, they build extraordinarily good boundary objects. They're these kind of frameworks that are really focused in on thinking about this problem in this way, how to measure it, how to get data to keep coming back on it frequently, and how to organize people in conversations around it. You know, I can say we invented it because I was there. We invented the 5 essential supports in 1995. When I went back, after having been absent from the scene for 12 years, in 2018, people are still talking about the 5 essential supports as how, in some form or another, anchoring their work in it. So that, you know, this powerful boundary object. The on-track work had the same sort of character. That this is a place where, when you think about research practice partnerships, where researchers do an incredibly important analytic, translational measurement task, because you know you got all this literature out there, and because you know as academics we're sort of trained to differentiate ourselves from everybody else. So you take a space like socio-emotional learning, and there are all these different sub-concepts and different ways of describing the space, and it's incomprehensible to practitioners. And so they kind of grab on something here or something there, we're doing that. But how you boil this down, we did the same thing in this work that we focused on at the foundation on the high failure rates in developmental math courses in community colleges, and one of what we call the core drivers for improvement was something called productive persistence, which is, our focus was, well, what do we take out of the social psychological literature that would be relevant to this issue of motivation and engagement? Because that's how the teachers and faculty pose the problem. The students are not motivated and engaged. And so, but you go to that literature, and there were innumerable concepts. There were over 1,000 different survey items that different researchers had used. How do you figure out what the essence of this is? That if you're going to convert this into a framework to inform practice, and they do a really good job, but that's the kind of, it's not what we normally train, it's not what we normally train research to do, because normally you got a concept, or you got something you're going to measure, and everything, you're deep down in a silo, and you can do that really well, but you can't see the connections. But to do this kind of work, you got to be able to see the connections, the conceptual connections.
And I think like part of like the measurement piece of it and the indicators is like how that's actually now being used in schools. Because I think, you know, it's not just we're trying to quantify it so we can look at progress, but it's actually a tool that really centers conversations inside of schools. It actually helps to define what the problem that they're addressing is, how are they doing on it, how are different students, how are they experiencing classrooms differently in the case of the social emotional learning piece. So it really changes practice, and it allows schools to engage with something that sort of in some ways may seem like this esoteric research finding or something that really doesn't have meaning, but really see what's happening inside of their school or inside of their classroom in a way that can be truly transformational.
Amanda, I know a little bit about your district and how it's changing in terms of demographics and becoming more multicultural. How are research practice partnerships helping districts on the diversity inclusion front?
Well, I mean, I'd say on the one hand, we're able to gather data around topics related to that they find important and share it with them, particularly data that's at the level of classroom interaction. So I think that part has been particularly useful because those aren't data that they would typically gather to kind of get a sense of what's actually happening between teachers and students. So, you know, for example, my colleagues have gathered data on, you know, what does classroom talk look like, which kids are spoken to, how often, you know, do students who are learning English, do they have opportunity to speak in the classroom at the same rate as their peers? What does that look like? And so I think sometimes those really, the data on the micro interactions can be really helpful for opening people's eyes to what the impact of instruction looks like. So I think that aspect has been, you know, quite powerful. But I think, you know, and another realm too is also kind of serving as a conduit to some of the recent research in the field, even if it's research that we're not gathering data on. When we are asked questions, I think part of what we've kind of cultivated through this relationship is a kind of an open dialogue of like, are you familiar with what the latest research is on this topic? Can you help us? Can you connect us to different resources that can be helpful in addressing our own, you know, particular issues here? So that's been helpful, and I get very excited when a teacher will ask us a question that they think that research might actually have a useful answer to. I mean, that itself is really powerful because, you know, they have this tremendous wisdom of practice as educators that they built up through their training and through many years of education in the classroom and so on. So they bring a set of knowledge that's different from ours, but they're seeing some useful ways in which we can come into conversation with each other.
Jenny, in Chicago, we spent the morning grilling Professor Trinidad on his book manuscript, which focuses on early warning indicators and trying to identify kids that are off track, so to speak, in middle school. And the Chicago Consortium really pioneered that work starting 20 years ago. But you want to talk more about that, Jenny, or other examples of how the consortium is really addressing inequalities?
Sure. I mean, I'll use the Freshman on Track example since I guess it's top of mind, and it's also, I think, one of the ways we really think about the work that we've done over time. So going back like 20 plus years ago, the district had a graduation rate that was hovering around 50%. It was, particularly low for students of color, so this was clearly one of the biggest issues facing the district and, schools across the country. And so there was research that was led by Melissa Roderick at the consortium, which sort of pointed to ninth grade as being kind of this pivotal time in a student's educational trajectory, which really shaped whether or not they would graduate from high school. And like one of the striking things about that piece of research was that you could look at a student in 8th grade, and like there was also a large qualitative component of it. So she was interviewing students who in 8th grade, you would have assumed that they were going to be extremely successful in high school. They were getting good grades in elementary school. They were coming to school at high rates. Their teachers thought that they were likely to be successful. There was nothing on there. But then when they got to high school, it was like they became a different person. Suddenly they were struggling. They weren't coming to class. They were failing classes. And so it really sort of spoke to there's something that's happening in this transition. And so with that insight, we developed the Freshman on Track indicator. And so actually originally this was being done to develop individual school reports and to have some way of understanding how students were doing early on in high school. And and as we were looking at this, we realized that there was this really strong relationship between whether or not students were passing their classes and having enough credits to be promoted into 10th grade. And so it's this like really strong insight, and it's still, it was something that we had disseminated these reports out to schools, but I think at that point in time there wasn't clarity on what do you do with this report? This is kind of interesting information, but what does this mean? John Easton at the consortium had a strong relationship with Arne Duncan, who later became the Secretary of Education. At the time, he was the CEO of the Chicago Public Schools. And Arne was looking for, he wanted something to put on the accountability system that wasn't besides test scores, because he wanted to be moving away, to be a little bit more holistic in it. And so, and he had kind of seen this research, and then, and so Freshman on Track became a part of the accountability system, which is actually a key, which was a big milestone in terms of changing what was in the accountability system, but it actually didn't dramatically change the Freshman on Track rates. When things really started to change was when the district had data systems that were in the schools, so that schools actually had information on students. So some of it was how students did before they came to high school, but I think most critically, they had a dashboard which showed which students were struggling at like 5-week intervals, and it really pushed teachers to be taking a closer look at course performance and thinking about how students were performing across that transition. And there was also a lot of work to help school teachers be working around this data. Like that's where I mentioned the Network for College Success. They were also instrumental in this. But a lot of this was like really transforming how practitioners were thinking about supporting their students. And we saw, once, with the advent of data, we saw dramatic increases in Freshman on Track rates. And like today, the Freshman on Track rates is around 90%. Our graduation rates are in the 80s. So we've seen like a 35 percentage point increase in our high school graduation rates, and a big difference in how teachers are thinking about their students. They're really seeing that there's a lot that they can do around student success. Because the changes in high school graduation rates, I mean, we still, there's still a lot of room to improve, particularly for young men of color, However, they've also seen the largest increases in their high school graduation rate. So I think it really sort of showed that a lot of the challenges that people were placing a lot of blame on the students, their families, and their communities were actually things that were in the locus of control of schools. That if they changed how they were supporting students, the types of relationships, the kind of monitoring and support, and how they were approaching this transition into high school, you could truly change it. And that was, I think, a big turning point for the district and for schools to be seeing, the power of what schools could actually accomplish and how they could truly be changing the life trajectory of students.
How did it change the relationship between teachers and students, do you think? I mean, do you have...
I think it was, I think one is that it changed success in class from being something that was about what the student was doing or not doing to something that was sort of this shared responsibility, or what can I do to why aren't you coming to my class? What can I do to help you figure out why it is that you're having trouble getting up in the morning and coming to school on time? Or if you're not turning in assignments, what's happening? What are you struggling with? You're not understanding the material. Do you not have a place to study? All these different pieces of it. And it's sort of changing the complexion about what the job of a teacher is and strengthening those kinds of relationships. And students also, from other research we've done with students, also felt like more seen, because the transition to high school is a big point where students are, as adolescents, they're trying to figure out who they are. Is this, do I belong in this school? Is this a place I can be successful? Do I want to be here? Am I still a good student? And so that's a huge struggle. And then when somebody is actually realizing that, oh, it's not going as well, because I think one of the things, kind of going back to Melissa Roderick's research, is that for a lot of these students, this was the first time they had ever failed in their entire life. And that's a devastating experience when you're as an adolescent, and you're trying to figure out, who am I, right? Am I a good student? Am I the type of person who's going to be successful in life? And this can really change, how they feel about themselves. And then when a teacher is starting to see that, I can tell that you're not doing well, but we can figure this out. We can do something about it, is something that really shapes, I think, how students are perceiving it, really fundamentally changing student experience. And I think it's kind of funny, because we talk about Freshmen on Track, it's an indicator, it's data, but really what this rests on are the relationships and really centering how students are experiencing school, and having teachers work together to be thinking about how they can be improving students' experiences inside of school.
Getting teachers to rethink their own role, that's pretty deep institutional change. I want to go to Tony, and then we're going to open it up for your questions.
I just wanted to piggyback on that work in Chicago, because I took those same perspectives into the foundation. And when we started to work on this problem of the high failure rates in developmental math courses in community colleges, which at that point in time was this absolute gatekeepered opportunity. We were about 70% of the students going into community college at that point in time were being sent into these sequence of developmental math courses, and approximately 80% of those students weren't getting out. And we were sending 500,000 students nationally down these pathways year after year. That requirement was an absolute gatekeepered opportunity. You didn't get your 2-year degree. You couldn't transfer to a place like Berkeley. You couldn't qualify for some technical certification programs. And so we started by, we brought some faculty together. And one of the issues that the faculty raised is, well, it's a student motivation and engagement problem. These students want to learn, but their lives are very complicated. They got to work lots of hours. They got childcare responsibilities, and these other things get in the way of their really sustaining the motivation and engagement. So that was, in some ways, that's how you externalize responsibility for a system that's clearly failing. And I just see this over and over again. Because as educators, you couldn't live with the idea that we're causing this failure to occur over and over again. So the explanation's got to be out there somewhere. But then, using some of these tools and methods of improvement work, well, why don't we talk to students? What do we kind of learn? And who are the students? And well, they're overwhelmingly first generation college-going students. Nobody else in many cases, nobody else in their families had ever gone to college. So there's this belonging uncertainty. They're now in college, and belonging uncertainty is a universal phenomenon. We all feel it when we move into a new context. But if you don't feel like you belong, you tend to disengage in terms of your commitment, because that's how you protect your own ego. I didn't fail because of me. I chose not to do this. There was this fixed mindset problem about mathematics. I'm not good at math, and it's been socialized into me since the 5th and 6th grade. That so you got how are we going to deal with moving them from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset? You look at instruction, and very traditional teacher at the front of the class. Students are in this very passive role, and geez, that's not encouraging engagement either. And then you look at the actual content of instruction, and students are being asked to factor quadratic equations, and these are adults, and they're asking the question like, why do I got to learn that? When would I ever use that? And so when we understood the experience through their eyes, it immediately started to set up some principal drivers to work on. There were these sequence of courses. The other thing we learned from the students is, well, there's a sequence of courses, and the courses change from semester to semester in time of day, and I can't take it. And we start to look at some data, and actually we're losing more students between the courses that are failing within any of the courses. So that in this case, the transition between the courses is the problem. And there are different groups of students, and you got this belonging uncertainty. So that leads you to a design idea. Well, what if we created a cohort where students stayed together? You register in September, you're in a pathway, you're with a group of students and a faculty member, and you're all organized together to accomplish a valued aim together. So you're building on this kind of social power of chartered network. So that becomes a design idea because it's linked to understanding what students are experiencing. On the instructional side, we're going to try to move to more problem-based rather than algorithm-based instruction. So we're doing that. And one of the pathways that got constructed was organized around pathway to college-level statistics. And the traditional organization of statistics tends to put probability theory right at the front. Well, probability theory is really conceptually complex. And in my own training, and I did my doctoral training in statistics and statistics department at Harvard. I almost died in probability theory. I almost never got to the rest. So when you start to see that, it's kind of like, no, don't put that up front. We're going to weave that through. Let's put something up front. This idea, you got to have an early success. You got to convince these students that you can be a mathematical thinker. You can learn this. So we're moving data analysis, looking at data, organizing data around questions, something they can succeed in early on. So, but those design ideas all came from them. But it's very much along this same idea. When you deeply understand what they're experiencing, it can transform the way you think. But that's very different than an academic coming in and I got this framework for deeper learning in mathematics that I think we should implement. You drew a lot of research findings in, but they came from understanding the problem. What research would actually help on this problem?
You mean if you had dropped out, we wouldn't have hierarchical linear modeling?
I still love them. I love wallowing in data.
Okay, let's open it up to your questions. Also, Tony mentioned social learning, and I know in leadership training there's a lot of conversation around the joint construction of what the problem is in a district or is in a school. And as young leaders out there in the audience and online, if you have an experience where that worked, where you worked with an outside group or university, it might be worth sharing to make sense of all you've heard in the last hour or so. So questions, comments? Oh, we're online already. So think about your questions. We'll go back and forth between online and you all here live. So what protocols or practices do you think are necessary for effective communication between practitioners, researchers, teachers, and family. Amanda spoke to this a little bit in terms of training grad students to become more agile as communicators, but other thoughts?
I think of it a lot of, I talked about this a little bit too, but I think a lot of it is like perspective taking and listening. It's like you're trying to put yourself in the shoes, like as a researcher, I try to think about like what is the perspective of teachers? What do they need to know? What's their context? How can I be helping them? It's not just drawing on what I know about it, but I can't actually be helping them until I am understanding where they're coming from and drawing on the knowledge and the wisdom and experiences that they have. So I think that's kind of the key part of this, is that sort of seeing that researchers have a lot of expertise, but they are not the only expert in the room. And that is, I think, a big part of like research practice partnerships, is that it truly is a partnership. It's not the researchers supporting practice, it's actually practice also supporting researchers, and there's sort of this cyclical, like a cycle of learning that goes around that really makes it become successful.
I was just informed that you all in the audience are submitting your questions online, which is kind of weird. Like, we don't want to hear your voice. For the first time, Erin Murphy Graham's not going to ask a question in person, so feel free to raise your hand the old-fashioned way. Okay, many of the approaches you describe are long-term strategies, but how do you combat or manage the pressure to make short-term results? Presumably the pressure from your superintendent or the pressure from your assistant principal, or there are immediate political pressures on educators.
Building an improvement infrastructure inside of public education, this is a fundamental challenge, because there's the urgency of now, and as soon as you latch onto a problem, you got to do it now, and you got to do it wide. And that makes sense if, we have no shortage of good ideas, but getting from an idea to something you can execute with quality, reliably at scale, we generally don't know how to do that. We've got an idea, we often don't know what really good tools, artifacts, the materials and resources are. Those got to get co-invented with practitioners together. For this stuff to work at scale, you got to have people who've worked in it who could support and teach others to it. But when you're first starting in one of these places, nobody's actually solved this problem before. Like the on-track work, nobody had actually focused attention here, so there's nobody who can teach other people to do it. And then you got the will problem, which is that the people in schools, we've kept sending things down to people in schools to do things, and there's the reform du jour. And so they tend to be reasonably jaded and sometimes outright resistant. Those are not, in an improvement science perspective, those are conditions where you got to start small. And you kind of start with people who are kind of, they're willing, they're interested, and the problems exist, but you also you're not going into corrosive environments where there's so many other things that are going on that are going to overwhelm any chance of actually figuring out what those tools and procedures are, building some actual success in it, because those people are learning how to do things, and if they succeed at solving this problem, they become your evangelizing leaders for spread. So but that means you've got to think about this as kind of, this is an innovation development problem. You got to create a space off to the side for this to happen. The skunk works, and that tends to run counter to how we think about work in districts. But you look at how how On-Track developed in Chicago, it developed exactly the way I just described. Melissa Roderick began, even before NCS existed, Melissa Roderick began with a few principals whom she knew were new to principalship, they were gung-ho, and they began to figure some of this stuff out. And and some of those people became coaches. One of them was Janice Jackson, who eventually moved up and becomes CEO of the system. But that's how this work that starts small and organically grows to scale. When you've got this kind of problem that nobody's ever paid attention to this before, we really don't know how to solve it.
Amanda, Jenny, thoughts on short-term, long-term?
Yeah, it is one of the things about researchers that we tend to move very slowly, right? We sort of have that luxury most of the times, and I think, we do feel pressure from the district, like, we need to have your results out there. But I think some of it is like what Tony's talking about, is that they're sort of like having our research out formally in public, whether it's a report or even longer term, a journal article. But because we have this relationship with the district, and we have every single one of our research projects has a partner or partners usually within the district. And so even though it's the end point of our research project may be on a much longer time horizon, we're meeting with them regularly. We're sharing our preliminary findings. We're working with them, helping them make meaning of our findings, and we're learning like how they are interpreting it, what they're seeing as useful. And so they're learning, or we're learning with them in it. So it's like, even though our results are not out in the larger world, they are sort of being internalized in the district throughout time, over time. And I think this is also something that works a lot when we have more controversial studies. Like, we did a study of school closings, which was like one of the most controversial things that has ever happened in Chicago. And and so that was a project where, there were a lot of really hard meetings with sharing those findings, but over time, they had a chance to process it, think about what this means. Also thinking of it, from something else that districts are really concerned about is like a public relations thing. Like, how are they going to respond to it in the press and in schools and the larger public to these findings? And then with something like Freshmen on Track, it's also like starting to think about, like, what can we do about it? How can we, they're starting to like think about this finding, like, oh, this is something that could be really useful to us. How can we share this out to schools? How can we be building, whether it's data systems or other types of supports around it? And it's, it's part of our model that the goal of this is not just to have something that's out in the public, but it's also this kind of joint learning process of our research findings that also makes it a lot more effective for change inside of the district, because they have had time to think about what we're learning and what our findings might mean for them. And they're not just having this kind of gut reaction of something that is the headline in the Chicago Tribune or something like that, which does produce a reaction, but it is not the kind of thoughtful reaction that we want to have happen with our research.
Sure, the next question. Jabari just told me in my earphone that if you raise your hand, and ask a question, he'll take you to lunch this semester.
That's my question. Hi. Oh, thank you, Paul. Oh, now there's a lot of pressure. So we credential new leaders and send them out into the field, and they have aspirations to make large-scale, small-scale school improvement. And what they find is that there's so much teacher turnover and leader turnover, for that matter, right, that the improvement process is complicated. Because we know that it takes a long time to make change. And so I'm just curious about your thoughts for new leaders. What are key considerations that they should be thinking about, given the fact that the field is so fraught with turnover and attrition right now?
Want to start, Amanda?
Sure. I would say, I have two pieces of advice. One is, as a principal I interviewed for a different study poignantly said, you have to decide whether you're going to be a sieve or umbrella. And so with respect to the initiatives that are coming your way, and make some really strategic decisions, because you can't do everything, and it wouldn't be wise usually to do all of the things that are coming your direction. And so are you going to be an umbrella and sort of try to shield out everything, or will you be most often people decide on sort of a sieve. But there are some times where principals have to also collectively work with others in their district with that umbrella approach, and be able to say, here's some things, the way this is rolled out is not going to work for us at all here, and so we need to kind of coalesce together to kind of present a united front. Because I've definitely seen since COVID, you know, many new initiatives are coming down the pike, and sometimes the principals we're interviewing in this different study are from a variety of different districts are finding that they're not well suited necessarily for the problems that they're addressing. And so they're wanting to put their energies into different things, and so it becomes really important for them to make some decisions about what they'll let in and what they won't. And the other thing I would say from this other work is to really attend to the socio-emotional elements of your staff and your own self, because this is becoming a huge issue, obviously the turnover, but you know, in this current moment, the emotional dimensions of collaboration are really important to pay attention to, of how teachers work together, how people's own, you know, individual emotions, but also those of the principal as well, because these are the things that are, you know, driving people out of the profession, unfortunately, right now.
Other question? What's been working for you young leaders out there? In terms of working with colleagues or others? Well, you have to ask a question. You can't just point to the screen.
My question is, thank you. How do you make, or what kind of extra efforts you make to, in order to have your voice heard, like, or your research findings heard, to by a larger scales of group of people or stakeholders in education? Because I heard many times you're talking about within a district or in a city level. Since I'm from China, so it's like very centralized kind of system. And once we have a policy and we implement from the top to the bottom. So my question is like, what kind of efforts you make to make good discoveries, findings, research findings, or the good approaches, and share with the whole country, and to solve a lot of problems, to make bigger impact in education.
And apropos of Professor Trinidad's book, in a highly decentralized system like we have in the US or West Europe, how do you mobilize people to get behind an intervention? Jenny, you want to?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, and I'm also probably getting into like some of Eos's book, but I think some of it is like for us, it's like having partners that are in the position to disseminate our findings, help people make meaning of our findings. I mean, one of the structures like the consortium has is a steering committee, which has like stakeholders from different parts of the education world in Chicago. So there's, you know, people from the district, people from the teachers union, people from different nonprofits. You know, it's a range of perspectives and sectors around education in Chicago. And, you know, and they see our work in progress. They get a sneak preview of our work as it's not before it's done, and have opportunities to provide feedback on it. So they're kind of bought into it. They have the opportunity to really do it. But we also, one of the roles that they have though, besides us learning from them, is sort of being ambassadors for our work. You know, and so I think we look for places like that where people understand our model, they can hear about our work, and they can start to talk to their colleagues, because I think one of the ways, like I think, you know, even with like social media, you can have a lot of eyes on something, but that's not really where change is likely to happen. You know, people look for ideas that they're actually going to act on from their colleagues and people they trust. And so, you know, our strategy is to figure out, you know, how can we make sure that we're sharing our findings, that we're building these kinds of relationships for the people who can serve as ambassadors and translators of our research, and getting more people aware of it, and aware of it in a way that they are much more likely to take it seriously, engage in it, and start to hopefully incorporate it into their practice.
Tony?
Just to add on this, that the senior leadership of the consortium saw this as an essential part of their work. The fabric of civic relationships they were building and nurturing in the city, which is very different than I got a report and I'll send a research assistant out to tell you about it. I mean, it was the most senior work among the most senior researchers that it's relationships that get cultivated.
Go ahead, Amanda.
I was just going to add, I would highly recommend taking a look at different versions of RPPs that are out there and ideally immersing your own self in that work. And if you know something's going on, someone you know is involved in something like this, go and sit in on some of their meetings, get a sense of it. You know, the Chicago Consortium is a really highly developed and well-sustained, wonderful example. If you're in Chicago, great to go take a look. But you may also have closer access to something that's even a more nascent RPP or even a tiny RPP that's a much smaller partnership, which may be more along the lines of what you might be able to start if you're starting small. So it's interesting to just look at how are the relationships built, what kinds of ways do researchers and practitioners talk together, what can you pick up about watching those encounters as a way to really think about how to position your own self, particularly in an environment where they're new to the whole idea of RPPs.
Yeah, and just like real quickly, I think when people sort of start, or our researchers start working at the consortium, I think one of the big transitional points is that they have to realize that even though their title has research in it, actually the engagement of it is actually the most important part of their work in many ways, and the time that they're spending talking to people, inside of the district and other places, and that's really where the impact of our work comes from. And we do good research, and that obviously matters greatly, but fundamentally in the longer term, why change is going to happen, or where change is going to come from inside of the district comes from these relationships and the time spent talking to people, helping them understand your research, making them really see this as being important for them to be thinking about.
Most modeling reflective practice and democratic discourse in professional circles. Unfortunately, guys, we're going to have to wind down. Eos, Jabari, do you guys want any final comments?
So, hello everyone. Let's give our panel a round of applause. That's really fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'm just here to maybe provide a summary and things for us to think about as we exit this webinar or this panel that we've had. And as I was thinking about the title of this talk, which is School Improvement and Research Practice Partnerships, I was trying to think of what's the most important part of that title. And I realized the most important part was the dash between research and practice. And let me tell you of 3 things that I'm picking up from this conversation, or 3 lessons. The first is really the importance of relationships. And initially, when we do research, and I as researcher and many students that I would mentor, we think of starting research with an idea or a research or a concept. But here, the most important lesson is that you start research with relationships. Relationships of trust, of knowing, of paying attention, of collaborating with others. And so it changes our idea of what research should be, and that research really is not just about, okay, I'm gonna research what's happening here, but about long-term relationships, even friendships. And that's what I've seen here as well in the Berkeley School of Education, that you make these connections, relationships, and friendships, and you see them through. And I think this is being emphasized as well when we were talking about it in the Q&A. So that's first lesson, the importance of relationships. The second is that those relationships are really relationships of learning on the ground, that in a way the questions arise from the ground, and often the answers are there as well. That there's a reciprocal learning that happens, and that we take inspiration from things that are happening there. As there's this image that I remember from Tony of like voices behind you, as you think of those research questions. So that's the second learning, or the second learning is on learning. So relationships, learning, and then the third is about empowering schools. That what we do is really there to empower schools, to provide lasting change, this coming together of different logics of helping schools have the vocabulary. So when we as researchers have the privilege of time to think about maybe something like early warning indicators or things like professional learning communities, that we're able to provide vocabulary and we're able to provide ideas that are powerful to change practice, to change expectations, to change culture, and to change the lives of individuals, to bring about improvement, equity, and excellence. And so maybe something for us to reflect about is, how do the relationships and partnerships that we form lead to learning and hopefully to lasting change? With that, I'll shift it out to Jabari to end this program.
My job is easy. We come full circle. I do want to say thanks, though, to EOS for being the spark plug to bring all of this together. I remember 30 years ago when I came here as a new professor, I would not have had any sense of imagination for bringing these major scholars into it. I would be like so humble and just hiding out in the hallways and stuff like that. EO has landed with a lot of emphasis on how he's able to contribute to so many of our programs. He's kind of a mild-mannered reporter, like from the Daily World, but he's really able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. And this is one example of it. I'll leave that metaphor for you to digest. And also, I want to add a thanks to Bruce. He's always been supportive of the work of the BSC and the work of the leadership programs, and it's been exciting to work with Bruce on all of these different levels. Big shout out to the panel. I was thinking when I was here earlier this morning and watching how intense the work was there, and then they continued to work after lunch, and then we're bringing them back to work again. This is almost like they are here for a job interview. This is what happens to like junior faculty, where they come to like, be associated with a university, and their willingness to, put that level of energy and time into this moment with us. Of course, we want to also say thank you again to Michelle Young and the BSC. She was totally behind this and had her role in helping to make this successful. 21 CSLA, and I have to give a shout out also to Rebecca Chung, who is the director of 21 CSLA. So a lot of the resources for what's available to make this a successful event. 150 people online. Wow, imagine if we had had this in person. This would be like a town hall meeting, it would be like, well, I'll leave it there. And finally, I want to just say thank you to Paul and Audra, who have been so instrumental in our operations team to making this happen. And the AV team. The AV team is so amazing. We are able to take some of the things that they have been able to produce in terms of the quality of the sound and the video and turn it right into usable products. That we just made a podcast out of one of the things they did with our last retreat. So that's pretty amazing. There's a question.
Yes. I'm going to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning if I don't get this out of my voice out. And so what's going to happen, you're going to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning because it's going to be on your mind. I'm a retired educator, and I took a class on how people learn. And that's when I realized I don't know how I learn. And I don't think that's something that we teach in schools. It's time management. It's how do you study? How do you take notes? How do you know what you know? How do you assess and test yourself? And I don't want to put another thing on teachers. I am hoping that that research will be surfaced, even though people don't look at it, teachers until 11 years has been out, but that research has been surfaced about that students still feel like school is something that's done to them. So I work with a 10-year-old right now, and I'm trying to even grapple with how I learn because it takes time. I mean, do I test myself? Been learning Spanish since 2017, but do I test myself? Do I assess? Do I monitor? Do I reflect? Do I do retrieval practice? Do I do space practice? We don't have that in school. And so when I see middle school students who get into middle school and they put their heads down, they struggled with the same thing that my 10-year-old that I work with. They don't have access to the curriculum, and so they're bumping through. They go to school and they do something that's done to them, and just briefly, one student, they have advisory, and you know, and I sub on 2 days a week, and I said, how are you getting a 4 in advisory? He said, I don't know, but it's because he shows up. And so I have students who go through the process, like we've gone through the process, we know what to do, we know how to get our grades. But many students of color, when they get to college, then that how to study, how to time management, how do you know what you know, how to advocate for yourself to become an independent self-learner is missing. So you wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm asking you to get that research out and get that message out. That's it.
Thank you so much. And I also want to thank this amazing audience. You should give yourselves a hand, please. I also wake up at 2 in the morning, but it has nothing to do with trying to figure out these issues. Leave it at that. Take care.